I'm sure many of you will have attended TASO sessions previously, so I won't spend too long kind of providing context to who we are, but for anyone that hasn't previously kind of interacted with TASO or joined our webinars, we are an independent charity. We were set up in 2019, by a consortium of King's College London, Nottingham Trent University and the Paper Insights team, and we spun out to be an independent charity around this time last year. Our main purpose is to serve as a hub for HE professionals to access our research, our toolkits and our evaluation techniques to really kind of aid the application of evidence within the HE sector and also support the delivery of kind of new research and evaluation. And we see this ethics guidance, which we'll be talking through today, as a key part of supporting additional or kind of new research and facilitating research within the sector. And our approach to kind of developing research and supporting the application of research is really kind of central to our mission. We're an affiliate What Works Centre. For anyone who's familiar with the UK government's What Works movement, this means that we're one centre among 9 or so other organisations, all focused on supporting the generation and application of evidence to kind of really kind of key policy issues. And we're funded by the Office for Students. Our funding currently runs to 2023. And I think central to the kind of rationale for funding TASO really emphasises the importance of kind of embedding research and evaluation within the HE sector. And so we really hope that the guidance we're producing will be used by you all to kind of achieve this kind of wider objective. So to skip forward, our vision and mission is quite kind of chunky. Our overarching aim is to eliminate equality gaps in higher education, and this really feeds through everything that we do, both in terms of the areas that we choose to kind of focus on in kind of understanding the current evidence that's available and generating new evidence, but also supporting how our kind of toolkit and evaluation tools are designed to support this kind of overarching vision. And our mission is linked to this, obviously, and is to improve lives through evidence-based practice in higher education. So we really kind of focus on the use of evidence to change kind of real life student outcomes. Ooh, thank you. And this illustrates our evidence cycle. There are 3 phases to our evidence cycle. Phase 1 is focused on understanding the kind of lay of the land, so understanding what HE providers are currently doing to evaluate their programs, and also kind of what the evidence generated through any evaluation is indicating about practices that work. And then we seek to, in phase 2 of our evidence cycle, really support the generation of new evidence. So building on our gaps analysis programs, TASO funds new research to generate new insights about what works. But similarly, as I mentioned earlier, we provide evaluation tools to support the sector to conduct their own research and evaluation. And that's where we see this ethics tool as sitting, to hopefully help people like yourselves who are watching this today to both design research and evaluation programs in a way that is ethical, but also to navigate some of the complexities of kind of applying to ethics panels, which can be kind of quite tricky to work out exactly how to land things, particularly when you're thinking about type 3 research, which is kind of has a few kind of complexities inbuilt into it. And then phase 3 of our evaluation cycle is review and dissemination, where we just seek to promote everything that we do, promote the availability of evidence and our toolkits and our evaluation tools. And so we do things like this today to really support the kind of dissemination of evaluation guidance. So now I'm going to hand over to Rain to talk through this project in particular. Yeah, over to you, Rain.
Thank you, Jess. So yeah, I'm gonna, as Jess said, I'll try and leave lots of time for Q&A and not spend too long on the theory, but I'm gonna do two things. One is to give you a little bit of a background to the project, I guess, to our thinking and kind of how it came to be and our hope for what we would like to achieve. And then I'm also going to give you a sort of rapid tour of the ethics guidance. So for anyone who has already looked at the kind of new section on our website, you'll see there's a number of different documents and resources, and I just want to, I guess, ground us in what we hope each of those resources will be able to provide for the sector. But first, for a little bit of background. So as Jess has explained, and I'm sure for many of you who are familiar with TASO, you're already familiar, but our mission is really to improve lives through evidence-based practice in HE. And so I think it's worth just spending a moment to think about what we mean by evidence-based, or what we think of as evidence-based. So on the left-hand side of the slide here, you can see the OFS standards of evidence, and we do align to these, as I'm sure many of you do, or anyone within a kind of large or small HE provider does. And we also have shown on the right-hand side here our own sort of table of the different evaluation and research methodologies that fit into each of these levels. So the type of methodologies that you might use for a sort of type 1 study, all the way through to the methodologies that we typically see in a type 3 sort of causal impact evaluation study. And the idea when developing this guidance was that we wanted to be able to support researchers and evaluators through all three of these phases. So the guidance does cover some of the often more qualitative methodologies that you might see in a narrative evaluation, so in that kind of level 1 or type 1, but it also takes us right through to sort of larger scale experimental and quasi-experimental methodologies that you see in type 3. And I think typically these are the methodologies that the sector are a little less familiar with. And obviously with that lack of familiarity comes just a less charted ground in terms of ethics applications for those type of studies. So we are hoping to be able to span that quite wide kind of continuum, I guess, of methodologies and ethical knowledge. So for anyone who's watched a TASO webinar, probably ever, or definitely recently, you will have seen this slide before, but I always try and bring us back to this evaluation cycle. So in the kind of formal TASO guidance, we call this a monitoring and evaluation framework, and it's these 4 phases that we think of as cyclical. So we start with a sort of diagnose phase, we go through to a planning phase, we obviously collect and measure data, and then we have a sort of reflect and dissemination phase. And in terms of ethics guidance or kind of ethical scrutiny, thinking about an ethics application, typically this will happen in the plan phase. So it's likely that you'll start developing your ethical thinking here. You might start to go through a process of applying kind of ethical scrutiny, or it may be that you're part of an institution that has what we call a REC, a research ethics committee, and you actually put in a formal ethics application as well. So typically we won't do this until we know about the approaches and the methodologies that we're hoping to use, because that's kind of key or pertinent to knowing what the ethical considerations might be. But we will certainly have applied this kind of ethical scrutiny and ethical thinking before we actually interact with participants or start to collect any data or talk to any kind of study subjects. So it'll be mostly situated within this plan phase of the overall evaluation cycle. So I wanted to give you, there's a kind of a key touch point here, I guess, in thinking about what research ethics focuses on. And there's 5 key points that you'll see also within the kind of main guidance. So the first thing here is that we need to think about the rights of individual participants or study subjects so that they know what's happening and they're able to agree to this. With that comes a kind of minimization or limitation of risk and harm to participants. We want to be able to ensure that we conduct research and evaluation that benefits society. So the idea when generating new evidence is that we're able to gain kind of new evidence on what works, and that by knowing what works, we are able to have a kind of greater impact or enhance the lives of those that we're working with, and that we ensure a fair balance of risk and benefits, so that neither of those one things, a risk or a benefit, significantly outweighs the other. And then finally, that we ensure that participants are offered the maximum level of confidentiality, so that they're kind of well informed and we protect them as a kind of key priority. As anyone taking part in the research or the evaluation study. So here we have kind of three terms, I guess, that we hear about quite a lot when doing research and evaluation, and particularly within the world of ethics. So audits on the left-hand side here are designed to gather feedback from participants or views on a project. And typically outcomes from audits are not intended for publication or to kind of go beyond the scope of that individual project. Although there may be times when it goes to kind of key stakeholders or a wider team, but it's not a full research study. On the right-hand side here, then we have a research study. So this is to develop new knowledge. It's intended for a wider publication. We'll often go to conferences or disseminate this quite broadly. And it's very clear from the beginning that it's part of that kind of generation phase that Jess talked about. So we're trying to develop and gain new knowledge. Somewhere in the middle, then, we have a service evaluation. So this kind of sits between the two. I think it's the most difficult to characterize. So often the same study could be described as either research or a service evaluation, or indeed it could be an audit or a service evaluation. So it's somewhere in the middle, and it's worth kind of thinking of the two ends, the kind of the bookends, I guess, of the spectrum of how we might categorize an evaluation or a research piece that we're working on. So within WP, widening participation, but also the kind of student success world, we cover a range of evaluation and research studies, and we typically see the terms audit and research most regularly used. So while an audit indicates those studies which are a lower level of ethical scrutiny than research, some evaluations are audit. So it might be that you sit within a WP team and actually some of the evaluation that you're doing would fall within the category of an audit rather than research. And therefore it may be that you don't require full approval from a research ethics committee, but it is important that you still kind of use some level of ethical scrutiny, or that you go through your own internal process of thinking through the ethics of the audit. And we hope that this guidance will allow people to identify whether or not what they're doing is audit or research, and if it is an audit, still apply ethical scrutiny without the framework or the scaffold of a formal research ethics committee. Of course, on the other side, we have research, and that will go through a research ethics committee. And again, the guidance would kind of walk you through that and help you make an informed application so that you are likely to have your proposal granted. So I wanted to touch quickly on who this guidance is for. I guess, the intended audience, the level of pre-existing knowledge that you have to be able to engage with it. And we're really trying to span quite a wide audience here. So on the one hand, we might have small teams that don't have their own research ethics committee, but that want to be able to navigate sort of ethical considerations, and that might be within an audit or a full research study. On the other hand, I guess we have teams that possibly sit within larger institutions or HEIs that do have a formal ethics committee. And again, we do hope that this guidance will provide the kind of principles or guidelines that allow those teams to navigate their own research ethics committee. So again, thinking about this quite wide kind of spectrum or continuum, I think this guidance is designed to allow a route in for really novice or early career researchers that don't have other people in their team that are familiar with the content, but also should provide the principles and guidelines for those with more experience that need to understand how to navigate their existing and their own kind of experts within the research ethics committee. So to talk you quickly through the different resources that we have and what they're aimed to do. So I know that many of you, or if not all of you, will have received a link to this as part of a reminder for the event today. So hopefully you have had time to kind of scroll through on our website and have a look. But if not, you will find the guidance under the evidence and evaluation section of our website. So under the resource hub, where you will find a lot of the general evaluation guidance, there's a kind of new tab called research ethics guidance, and everything sits within there and is accessible through the website. So it consists of a series of documents. The first is a brief introduction to research ethics, and this is just a web page with about 500 words, not loads of text that you can read through, which will just give a very broad intro to research ethics if you really are new to the concept and kind of an early career researcher. The second document then is what we have been calling the core guidance document. So this is the main resource. It's a downloadable PDF. It's about 50 pages, and it's the primary resource that will take you through all the different sections and all the different topics or considerations that are part of a robust ethics application. We then also have a number of case studies. So we've got 5 of these, and we've tried to develop case studies that span a variety of topics and also different methodologies, and we'll come to look a little bit more at that in a moment. And then we have something that we've called navigation checklists. So these are kind of grids or tables with a series of questions, a bit like a kind of data protection impact assessment, I guess, that helps you find a route into the guidance. So it will ask you a question, and then depending on what you think the answer to that is, it will signpost you to different sections within the core guidance document. The idea there being that the document isn't necessarily read cover to cover and kind of needs to be in chronological order, but that you could like skip into a section on incentives and compensation, for instance, if you're particularly interested in that topic and wanted to make a more informed application. And then finally, the last 2 sections there, you can see consent forms and participant information sheets. So what we've done here is create a number of like downloadable pro formas. So they're standardized approach to consent forms and participant information sheets, and you can just download them and adapt them and use them as part of your own ethical processes and also applications. I'm going to quickly whiz you through each of these. So as I said, this is a very short introduction to research ethics guidance, and this is probably a good place to start for anyone who's brand new. So it will give you a high level intro and then also help you find a route in to the core guidance. The core guidance itself then is the kind of main resource, and it gives you a range of common ethical issues experienced by both evaluators and researchers. So it's probably quite small on your screen, but you'll see there's a number of sections kind of labeled A all the way through, and you should be able to navigate your way to whichever topic you're interested in. And this covers kind of the most basic or straightforward approach to research studies. So it might be like fully informed consent for a qualitative study with adults, for instance, all the way through to these potentially more complex or at least less familiar ways of conducting evaluation. So things like randomized control trials or different quasi-experimental designs, working with large samples and kind of big data sets. So this is the main thing, I guess, and this is the core resource that you should be able to use. For the case studies then, so as I mentioned, we've tried to span quite a range of topics here. So the first case study covers a qualitative example of a research study and all the ethical considerations that come with that. We then have a cluster randomized control example, an example of a mixed method, so combining qualitative with quantitative. We then have a large scale quant study, so thinking through kind of big data and how to navigate the ethics of large data, and then just a regular randomized control trial as well. And this uses a summer schools example, which I know is quite a hot topic at the moment. So for each of these case studies, you will receive a kind of, or you can download like a 2-pager mostly. I think some of them are 3 pages. Again, it's just a simple PDF that you can kind of print out and use or save to your own computer. And each of them will talk you through the kind of aim of the research study and the methodology being used, the key ethical considerations that typically come with that methodology. So comparing kind of the ethical considerations of a qualitative study using semi-structured interviews versus a randomized control trial, for instance. And then the limitations of the research as well, both relative to the actual case study, but also to the overall methodology. The navigation checklists I've explained a little bit, but really this is designed to help practitioners or evaluators practically navigate the research ethics and the questions and scenarios that they're interested in. So it provides a sort of framework to accompany the core guidance document. And each of these checklists covers a slightly different like level of study. So you can see the first one is following a standard process. The second chart, the middle one, is looking at an example where it doesn't quite fit within or comply by the standard process, so more ethical scrutiny is required. And then the third one is focused on large-scale quantitative studies. So as you can probably tell and know, because it's kind of exactly what TASO says they're going to do, is that we're really trying to help equip or kind of upskill practitioners to be able to navigate these larger scale studies as well. So that third navigation chart should help with anyone that's new to that. As an example then, this is again a sort of like downloadable checklist. So each of them is, you can just kind of click on the website and should be able to download a PDF. And at the start of each checklist, there are instructions for how to use it. Many of them, or two of them at least, also have a decision tree to help you identify where your research or your study fits. So is it an audit? Is it a service evaluation? Is it a full research study? And you should be able to kind of follow that logic through. And then it takes you through a basic checklist that asks you a number of questions. So for instance, one of the questions here is like, will it be necessary for the participants you're working with to take part in a study without their knowledge? So things like a covert observation, which might be necessary for some studies. And then depending on your answer to that, whether you think it does need to be covert or it doesn't, it will link you to different parts of the ethics guidance. So you can see, for instance, like see section E, and then section E will describe how you approach the ethics of a covert study, for example. And then at the end of the checklist, you're provided with further instructions. So again, much like a data protection impact assessment, this is the kind of ethics equivalent. It might say, if you've answered no to any of these questions, then further ethical scrutiny is required and you need to go through a research ethics committee. So it should just help guide you through that, and again, help you find like access points into the core guidance document so that you're not just reading it cover to cover. And then, so the final two sections of the guidance are these consent forms and participant information sheets. These, I anticipate that anyone engaging with these will obviously need to kind of personalize them, make them more relevant and specific to your own research and to your own study. But this is just a nice way of not starting with a kind of blank page. And again, I think for people who are part of a larger institution or a larger provider and you have your own research ethics committee, you may already have a kind of standard approach to consent forms and participant information sheets or your own templates. But for anyone who doesn't or isn't part of a larger institution, this is a nice way to just cover the key points that should be covered when both gaining consent and informing participants. And within both of these, we've got a kind of what we might call a standard or a regular version, and then a more simplified version for working with either young audiences or vulnerable audiences that need a more basic or a more kind of simple breakdown of what it is that the study's about and how their consent is being gained and how informed they are. So that's a kind of very rapid whistle stop tour of the guidance overall. What we're going to do now is have time for a Q&A, and we're very happy to take questions both on the content of the guidance. So if you've looked through the kind of core guidance document and there's something that doesn't make sense to you or something you want to hear a little bit more about, please do drop your questions in the chat box, but also happy to take more kind of practical questions about how to use the guidance, or if there's a document that's not working for you or anything like that, do also feel free to ask that in the Q&A. So what I will do now is hand back to Jess to pose some questions to us, and hopefully we can answer as many as possible.
Thank you. Yes, please do use this opportunity to drop your questions in the Q&A box. As I mentioned earlier, we really want this to be as interactive and kind of responsive to any issues that you're currently working through as possible. I'm going to kick off, using kind of my position as chair, luckily to ask a question about a project that we've been working on. Some of you may have heard of the randomized control trial that we're delivering to evaluate the impact of summer schools. When we were developing our application to our ethics panel, we were kind of grappling with the issue of opt-out consent, and found this guidance particularly helpful in terms of aiding our thinking on that. And so, Richard, it'd be really helpful if you could just talk through why in this context we thought opt-out consent was appropriate. So for a bit of contextual information for anyone who doesn't know the details of the project, essentially it involves randomly allocating students to either a treatment or a control group where they either take part in a summer school or don't. And the research activities involve participating in surveys or focus groups throughout their kind of either their journey through the treatment or control group.
Okay, so this is a kind of interesting question which asks you to think about what actually are you requiring of the participants. So the point here was that there's a randomization process going on at the beginning into two groups, and that further on there'd be when there were particular interviews or activities going on, consent would be fully informed and given. The question is whether or not people needed to give consent to actually be involved, or what kind of consent they should give in order to be put into the randomized situation. The issue here is that it was in the gift of the organization as to how to separate up individual participants. Actually, individual participants didn't have to give their consent in order to be put into these randomized two groups. That was just simply part of the process of the summer schools. And so actually, there was no need actually for consent. So the issue here was, it wasn't that you were going to give opt-out consent. The fact is you didn't really need consent at all. But by offering so-called opt-out consent, what you do is you allow, it's a courtesy to people to let them know what's happening, and that they can essentially decide to opt out. But actually opt-out consent isn't consent at all, because it presumes when you've got consent, you want evidence that you've actually got the consent of your participants. And the problem with opt-out consent is it presumes consent without actually having any evidence for it. So we know lots of people don't read bits and pieces. So the idea of the opt-out consent is that you start from a belief that people have read everything they're given you, and that they've decided not to contact you because they want to stay in your study. Well, there's little evidential basis that happens, whereas opt-in consent actually does require you to have evidence that your participants do actually want to take part in your study and are consenting to do so. So the issue for this particular project was not that opt-out consent was an appropriate way of gaining consent, but actually consent wasn't needed, and opt-out was given as a courtesy to participants, just to let them know that if they really objected to this, they could say no, but it wasn't really needed ethically.
Thank you. Yeah, I personally found it particularly interesting thinking about the other touch points along the way where participants would be giving that consent. So, for example, by completing a survey, they're naturally giving consent to do that. Just to ask a quick follow-up question before I review the questions coming in from the Q&A. We spoke there about randomization. We often get asked about the ethics of randomization and whether that is an ethical approach to allocate people to treatment and control groups. It would be really helpful to get your reflections on this, particularly I know the guidance covers a really interesting section on equipoise. And so thinking about kind of how randomization sits alongside any kind of consideration.
Yeah, okay, so the issue about randomization isn't so much that randomization is good or bad. Randomization is just a way of dealing with something and may give rise to positive and negative consequences. And very often in an ethics committee, we're interested in the consequences rather than the randomization itself. So where you're allocating to one group and to another group, and part of the problem here is study and control groups or treatment and control groups don't always help in terms of the language, but you're randomizing to two groups. if you don't actually know which group is going to get the better deal, that's you've got equipoise, that you don't know whether your actual the new treatment or the new way you're going to deal with these students is going to be any better, or in fact may even be worse than the students on the standard program. You just don't know that, then you're in equipoise, and therefore there's no consequences of being allocated to one group rather than the other, because we just don't know which is going to be the best way forward. So the randomization there doesn't actually do anything. There's no particular consequences for the participants involved. So there are ways in which randomization, the question is, well, is there any implication here? If you are randomizing whether or not people become part of, say, a summer school. Let's kind of imagine a scenario where you say, you know, you can be in a summer school, you can't be in a summer school, but we allocate on some way. And normally we might allocate on first come, first serve, because that seems fair, or we could allocate purely on randomization. That seems to me to be as equally fair an approach to allocating into a particular activity. Now, that seems to me to be areas where, you know, randomization there does have an implication for participants, but the randomization is as fair a way of allocating a limited resource as any other way. And so randomization there would be, in my view, would be considered ethically appropriate in that kind of situation. So I think randomization itself isn't the issue. The issue is one, are there any consequences as a result of randomization? And two, is the randomization essentially a way of simply allocating limited resources that's as fair as any other way you could come up with in a particular situation?
That's really helpful. We've had a question from the audience around, again, RCTs and the potential that ethics board sometimes thinks that there's an element of deception if participants might not know that they're taking part in a trial. So I think this in some ways might be similar to the example that I gave of summer schools. But I'd be keen to get your reflections if you're not able to inform participants upfront that they're taking part in an RCT, are there ways to design that in a way that is kind of ethical and that would be received kind of as seen as acceptable by ethics committees?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things looking at the question that I would say, you know, are important in terms of an ethics committee, in terms of, I think, one is the language we use. And the second is being as specific as we can be on what the implications are of what we're going to do. So if we're going to not tell people, then we might not say that's deception. Often we talk about it's covert. We just aren't telling anybody that we're doing research. And often that's fine. So if I'm doing research sat in a coffee shop in a public space, it might well be fine just to do covert observation. There might be no ethical problem there because it's a public space and people can expect to be observed. So there are places where covert research is fine, and particularly in relation often to where it wouldn't be possible to do any other kind of research. So that's a key thing, is it would be impossible to do it any other way. The issue, I think, in the question is RCTs asking for alternative ways, is that it may be possible for you to design your study in another way that gives you the same level of evidence that you've had before. It might just be more expensive or more complicated, but expense and complication aren't necessarily a reason for not telling people the truth. Okay, so that's the first thing, is to say I think an RCT could, a REC could say, we think there's a way of doing this without doing covert research. But the other side of it is to be specific about what it is that's actually ethically problematic in the study. Is that if you're looking at data from students, as we do all the time in universities, looking at data from our own students, we don't tell them that we're looking at data in particular kind of ways and chopping it up in particular kind of ways and allocating them, in effect, to particular kinds of groups in particular kinds of ways in order to do that. So all of that's covered in a university sense by what students sign up in terms of their registration. So we have a lot of that covered. And we don't tell students because it actually has absolutely no implication on their studies or anything else about their life. Okay, so that might be a perfectly legitimate way to say, well, actually, really, what's the problem here? Or it may be that you're essentially allocating randomly And you can do that. You know, if it's, for example, a module tutor deciding that they're going to allocate 2 particular groups for a particular teaching situation to see whether or not one way is better than another way. It's up to the module tutor how to decide the groups. The fact they do that randomly seems a perfectly reasonable way as any other, and then you can follow that trial through at a module level. You can do that at a course level. You can probably do that at a university level in certain instances, without that was within your control to do that kind of randomization. So it's not the randomization in terms of the RCT here that's the issue. It's as I said before, it's the consequences of what happens and being specific about what the ethical consequences are. I mean, if it's the case that you were to put a necessary burden on widening participation students, so for example, that may be a reason why they might say, well, actually in this RCT, we're not going to allow this because it places too much burden on widening participation students, which is often a real risk in some studies. But you would need to think, I think, through is what are the consequences that might follow from your randomization. If the answer is nothing, then I would argue that seems to me to be a perfectly good way of doing it. Certainly if it's within your gift to randomize, and randomizing is as fair a process of allocating into different groups as any other way. But I think from a rep point of view, it is the fact that we do hold individual rights quite highly in our society, and therefore to deceive just because it's a good, not just of you, but of a cohort that's coming down the line in a couple of years, just because of some broader social good, requires you to move away from those kind of liberal views about the individual to a more communitarian view about the fact that actually the rights of the individuals have to be subsumed to the good of the community at large. And that's problematic, I think, in a contemporary area. That's just the choice. If it can't be done any other way, then I think a rec should be able to make a decision that in this case, covert research is ethically acceptable if there's proper debriefing at the end. So it's not that covert research is impossible, it just needs to be thought through in terms of the consequences and what the implications of that are, and whether or not there are alternatives that could give you the same kind of evidence.
Thank you. I think the report includes an example from our MyON, an RCT that we conducted on a MyON program, where where a provider randomly allocated different letters to parents and then tracked attendance data at session. And I think in that context, you advised that it's perfectly within the right of a school to kind of decide what communications they send, and they're also collecting that outcome data regardless of whether the trial is taking place. And so there's quite a lot of variation in terms of like the ethical barriers.
And it's equipoise as well in that kind of cases. Yeah. Nobody knew which letter was going to be better anyway. So there's, the sense is it is just don't know what the difference is going to make. We don't know. It's within our gift to be able to decide what we send to parents. Therefore, it seems reasonable to us to send, if we want to take the effort to give 3 different versions of the same letter, then that would seem, there wouldn't seem to me to be any real ethical rationale for rejecting that as a suitable study.
Thank you. I have a relatively kind of broad question, but I know within ethics, I know that when making applications to recs, it can be quite easy to conflate issues of ethics with issues of data protection. And I just wonder if you have any kind of reflections or advice as to how to really try to treat those as quite separate entities and understand and focus on specifically ethics in relation to, I don't know, informed consent, I guess, is the area that particularly crops up.
Okay, I mean, I think it's the easier thing to do is to separate perhaps the more legal dimensions to data protection from the concerns that we have that our data belongs to us. So we have a kind of intuitive view that certainly data about me belongs to me, and by that I don't often mean my email address. I actually mean other things that my opinions, my views, etc. They belong to me, and if I'm going to share them with somebody else, then I want to know that they're going to take those that possession of mine, that data that is mine, seriously and look after it. So I guess that's clearly the ethical issue in terms of a researcher, actually, I want to have confidence and trust in them that they're going to use my data in a way that's the way that I want it to be used. Okay, so I think on the ethics front, what we're looking for is that people know what you're going to do about the data. This is why fully informed consent is, if you like, the kind of, to use the terms in relation to RCC, the gold standard of ethical approval, which is, it's fully informed and you've got full consent, which is recorded in some way. Is that I want to know that the people are going to take my data, they're going to use it in the ways that I would want them to use it, and they're going to look after it, and that it's me that's giving it them. I'm consenting to giving it to the researchers. It's not being torn away from me. So if you can kind of imagine, identity fraud's a big thing. People go through rubbish bins, etc., and pick out my identity and suddenly piece it back together. I don't just feel like it's a nightmare for me in terms of a whole range of ways, but actually somehow it feels personal that my data has been taken away and used by people in a way I've not consented to. So the ethics side of it is to take account of the way we feel about our data, our personal data, that actually we want it to, we're happy to share it, but we want it to be used by people we trust in ways that we think we understand, and that we've done that freely. We've given it to you. It's not been taken from us. So that I would say would be the ethics, and that's why informed consent is important around the ethics of data. There's another set of more legal requirements, which perhaps I'm less worried about in terms of my personal engagement with data, which is around securing that data, making sure that data is in password protected files, etc. Of course, I am, if I thought about it enough times, I am a little concerned about it, but that's the kind of legal side, and that's much more technical. And that's why when we're working in research ethics committee, if it's about informed consent, if it's about those kind of areas of data, we would make decisions on where it's around the specific legal and technical issues around data. That's what we have a data protection team for and officers for, and we would go to them and require that they would look at a project and tell us whether or not it satisfies the law, but also whether it satisfies, if you like, the spirit of the law and not just the precise technical requirements of the law. So that's broadly the kind of distinction we make, and there is a kind of an area in the middle where which calls for judgment, and that's I know that irritates some of my colleagues around the university, which is we don't always agree on the judgment because projects change subtly over time. So something that can be fine in one project suddenly doesn't look so fine in another project, and it's quite difficult to kind of say precisely why that's the case, but it is around judgment in that kind of murky area in between the two.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think that also is really interesting in the context of randomisation, where actually it might be about how people feel about a process more so than the process itself, and also recognising that actually it might be information that they provide further down the line where it's actually really important to kind of get consent as on how that is used and shared. Yeah. Going back to the questions that have been posed by the audience. So there's a question on defining when an activity is service evaluation and when it should be treated as academic research. Are you able to advise on the distinction there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that are really critical. One is how far you're going to disseminate the research or the evaluation itself. If it's going to be out in the public domain, then almost always it will be research. I'm going to caveat my words quite slightly here, because as again, it's a kind of judgment call, but almost I would find it difficult to see a study which was going to be publicly disseminated, whether that's in a journal, on a website or whatever, and accept that didn't require full ethical scrutiny. If it's going to be shared around a group of practitioners, if it's going to be perhaps shared around a course team or a team in WP work, and maybe with stakeholders, heads, teachers you're working with, etc. in schools, that I think probably does fall under the ambit of audit. So because it's got very limited shared. Whether something's going to be shared in a sense as a case study to a TASO conference comes into the kind of somewhere in between, because in one sense we want people to talk about their practice, and that's in a fairly public domain. What I guess I start to say there is then it becomes, it's an issue then of actually, as a presenter, somebody who's talking about something, as to what use you're making of the data, and to what extent you're actually talking about the data, or to what extent you're talking about the team's response to the data. Because I think that kind of shifts, is that, you know, we have a lot of data internally in universities and companies that we draw upon, but we don't talk about that data. We're talking very much about our response to it. And I think if we're talking about our response to it, to data that we know about, then I think that still exists in the kind of audit end of the spectrum. I think where we're experimenting is the other side, is if you're experimenting on or in some way, shape or form, trying something new that you really don't know whether it's going to work. I think that fits again in research, because it has potential consequences and potential negative consequences for participants, and it needs external review, whether that's an external eye within the organization or within, you know, universities, etc. In NHS, we have research ethics committees that do that role. It requires a kind of overview and an external eye to see, are these risks that you're taking with participants, are they proportionate, and have you done the best you can to be able to reduce those risks? So that seems to be the element of whether or not there's an experimental component, in terms of you don't really know what the outcome is going to be. And that's the other thing that I would say, if that's the case, then it clearly should be research, and it's not audit. Audit generally is looking at things that we know are generally positive. We just either don't really know why they're positive, or we just want to get a better view about how we could develop those in particular kinds of ways. So it is a kind of this service development idea. We just want to see whether we can do it better, as opposed to experimenting with new ideas.
Thank you. Again, really helpful. Another one of the areas that TASO's always thinking through when designing research is the use of incentives, or essentially kind of compensating people for their time for participating in research. I know within our previous conversations and the guidance, there was a clear distinction between incentives and compensation. And so it would just be great to get your reflections on how we might approach kind of giving people something so that they feel that their time is being kind of well spent participating in research, but not kind of going too far.
Okay, and I think this is one of the places where language is shifting. And when we were designing the guidance, and I also said, there are 5 of us in the team. So I know Andrea and Jerry are here on the call, but Peter and Terry are also involved in this. We had a number of different discussions and looking at where the language of research ethics is going, as much as where it was maybe 5 years ago. And I think one of the issues is not so much a change in practice, but a change in being clear about how we describe practice. So the idea, the language of incentives suggests that it encourages people to take part when they wouldn't otherwise be willing to take part. Okay, so at its hardest level, we could describe that as the fact that we're asking them to take part when it's against what they think is their best interest. And that only might be marginally, like they're giving up time that they wouldn't want to do, but it could be that actually they really don't want to take part in this research, but actually the money we're offering is enough to encourage them to actually take part in what against their best judgment. So in a sense, we're kind of using it as a way to force people to get involved in the research. So that's what kind of implied by incentive, that where we don't think the research enough is encouraging enough for people to take part in themselves. And we want to separate and distinguish that from compensation, which says we recognize that you want to take part in this research, but that it's costing you in time or expenses in terms of getting here. So we're going to compensate you in a sense for that, either for that time or for those expenses that you've incurred in coming and being part of this study. So in the incentive case, we're saying that it was never ethically appropriate to encourage people to do something that they didn't want to do, that was against their best interest. But often we use the term incentive for just describing giving a bit of compensation and expenses. What we're trying to be clearer on in this guidance, and I think in terms of the general move in terms of research ethics, is that we should get rid of incentive as a bad thing, and we should hold on to the idea of compensation, where what we're saying is we're doing everything we can to make sure that the participants are freely involving themselves in the study because of the study. And then we're providing some compensation as a thank you for their time and their involvement, rather than and that thank you should be appropriate. So if it's the size of that thank you should be appropriate to the kind of participants we have. So offering people £300 to be involved in our study might be totally inappropriate to describe as compensation. That really is an incentive, whereas £10 might be an appropriate kind of compensation of thank you for their involvement.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat on guidance around disseminating findings. From an ethics perspective, what would your recommendations be on disseminating findings with research participants?
I would normally say that if research findings are to be out in the public domain, then I would normally look to make sure that the research participants know where they can get them, or that they are able to sign up to be able to be sent a copy when they're finished. I think it's perfectly appropriate that if you've been involved in research that you get to see the final findings of that. Caveat on that, I think, is where you're doing something that looks like research, but actually you don't have the power to actually say whether or not it becomes public. So some things we do in the university, actually it's the vice chancellor and others who get to decide where, what version of something goes out at the end, because essentially they're internal reports we're generating, in which case it would be difficult to give an absolute agreement to participants. They could have some view of the research findings. But I think if the research findings are in any way made public, then I would think that it would be a part of good treatment. I mean, reasonable, polite manners is to make participants either aware where they'll be able to find the final versions, or to be able to find a way to communicate that with them. And obviously, difficulty there is you don't want to collect extra email addresses that you don't really need, apart from dissemination, which is where the kind of the data protection issue kind of conflicts here. So often we would, when we're doing a project, we'll set up a free WordPress research site that carries everything about the project, and then we'd put the final project up on that on a particular date, so people could know that where they could find the final report.
That's fab, thank you. I'm going to squeeze in one final really quick question. Yeah. Based on your experience of sitting on a research ethics committee, I think this is covered in the report, but I'd be interested in getting your reflections on what are the kind of top red flags that make you think, oh, I'm not going to engage with this, and kind of, or not engage with this, but this won't go from further.
Okay, I think my biggest judgment is whether I have something called ethical confidence in the researcher, so that the researchers actually told me what they're going to do. They thought about the ethical implications. And the biggest red flag is when I see things and it just looks like the ethics hasn't been thought through. And then I say, even if this bit is technically correct, I just don't really have confidence that that the ethics has been thought through properly. So that's a general red flag when I read an application. I think where I'm looking for fully informed consent as a kind of standard, and if I'm not getting that, I want to know why it's not fully informed consent, and there are really good reasons why you don't get fully informed consent. But I want the researcher to tell me. I don't just want to guess it. So things like, I'm doing an anonymous questionnaire, and in the paperwork there's no mention of a consent form. You don't need a consent form. You just need to put on the questionnaire something about what you're going to do with the data, and when they press submit, that's consent. But I want the researcher to tell me that. So those are the kind of red flags that I look for. And around the informed consent, the other thing I look for is the research written up in a user-friendly way. So is the application, but also any information sheet, is that written in a way that would actually be okay for the participant group? So those are the kinds of things I look for. In a sense, I'm not always looking for the technical things. It's that I'm looking for, has the researcher really done the work of thinking that there may be ethical implications to their research, rather than saying, actually, this research is bound to be fine because I know it's going to do some real good. And I would say, of course, it's going to do some real good. We accept that, but we want to know it's going to do some real good and be ethical. And I want to see that the ethical thinking's been done. Thank
you so much. That's all we have time for today. So really appreciate everyone attending and dropping your questions in the Q&A. And thank you so much to you, Richard, for your
Pleasure.
really informed and thought through answers. We really recommend that people go away and take a look through the ethics guidance, which is now available online. And yeah, I hope you find it useful. Thank you so much for attending.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all. Thanks a lot.